Hey guys, Avid Assistant here, welcome to another video. Now in this one, by request, we're going to go through how Effects works in Avid and how it differs to other NLEs, a tour of the Effects Palette and the most commonly used effects and, how to get started using them. Now one thing that's important to note here is that when I'm talking about, effects work in Avid, I'm not talking about any plugin or effect that you can drag and drop onto your video clip and it's going to transform it into some clip that looks like it's from, the latest Hollywood blockbuster. There's ads promoting that kind of thing quite a lot online for the likes of Premiere, Final Cut, sometimes for Resolve, but that's not quite a thing in Avid. Even in terms of plugins for effects, they're few and far between. There are some, and there's some really, really good ones by the likes of, Boris, for example. Their Continuum and Sapphire suites are really, really good, but they do come at a cost. Those are professional tools. There are even some professional visual effects work done on high-end shows that are using those plugins within Media Composer to do those shots. So those are manual tools to get those things done for VFX compositors that know what they're doing. Avid is a professional tool. It's a professional editing platform, and it is mostly based around an offline workflow. If you don't know what I mean by offline, you can check out my Proxy workflow video explaining how that works in Avid. It is easily the most popular video on the channel, so it does seem to be something that a lot of people are wondering about in Avid and how that worked. But in terms of talking about effects, we mostly use effects in Avid Media Composer in a much more simple way. We will use it to show what an effect will look like, to communicate it. So if there's a visual effect that's really important, say for a scene, say someone's getting shot and we need to see a muzzle flash and a blood spurt just to sell the idea, then we can do a really quick rough comp by adding in some Mac keys and things like that. If we need to zoom in and do a reframe, retimes, things like that, anything that is essential to the story, to tell the story visually, that we need to see in the edit during viewings, we can do an offline temp version, an offline visual effects, but with the knowledge that this is going to get redone later to a higher standard. The basic Avid effects are also used creatively for storytelling. Maybe you need to do some basic split screen or retimings like we mentioned before, green screen keying. It depends on the project. It depends on what you're doing and what your position is. My experience in offline scripted, we're almost always doing offline effects works, so we're just trying to tell the story, so it's not quite as jarring just having a text box up saying man gets shot here. We can roughly show what it'll look like, and it helps inform the visual effects when they later do it as well by showing them placement and timing and things like that. But the likes of your motion VFX that make all kinds of cool presets for doing lightsaber effects and all kinds of other things, you're not really going to get that for Avid. You'll notice them making plugins for all the other applications, but not for Media Composer. It's not really a thing, and it's not really something that we really need in Avid anyway for the marketplace that Avid is mostly used for. But getting on with it, let's take a look at effects inside of Avid Media Composer. Now, first off, there's two places that you will find your effects for video in Avid. Now, the first one will be the Effect Pallete, which is here. I'll drag that to make it a bit bigger. And this is where you'll find, the bulk of your effects that you're going to add purposefully. But there are also some effects that Avid will apply to a clip automatically. Now, this may be for a couple of reasons, but it's usually to do with the clip's resolution or frame rate, the clip's properties differing from the Avid project that you're in. So, for example, here, all of my material here is at about 4K or slightly higher, but my project I'm cutting in is 1080. So Avid adds this effect on top of all of the clips that we can see here. Any icon that we can see on the clip is going to be some kind of effect. And if I open that up in the effect editor, we can see that this is frame flex, which allows me to do some basic reformatting of the clip. I can zoom in, I could do a reframe. If this clip it isn't, but if it was a different aspect ratio to my project, I could fix that there with letterboxing and formatting options there. You can see here as well, we'll also get the same thing if the frame rate of our material differs from our project. So you can see the frame rate of this project here that I'm working in is 23.976, but the frame rate of this material is 25 FPS, standard PAL television format. So it's added what Avid will refer to as a temporal adapter onto it. And basically what this temporal adapter is doing is it's retiming it to fit within the speed and playback of the frame rate of your current project. Now you can tinker with this setting a little bit and change it by opening up in the motion effect editor. You say I'll do that here. I have all these tabbed in here, but you'll find both the effect editor and the motion effect editor in here under the tools menu. They are right next to each other, along with the command palette. They are all right there next to each other, but I just have them all tabbed right here. Now in this instance, we can choose the type of respeed that Avid's doing. I'm not going to go through all of these. That's a step ahead of what I want to get into in this video. This is more just an overview of effects. This drop-down menu is the different methods by which Avid is doing the retime. Feel free to look up more information on these different options and how they work, but that's what these are for. You can see here it's resped it by 104.27%, and that's the retiming that it has to do to meet my 23.976 project. Now we can promote this motion adapter to a Timewarp effect, which is our basic retiming effect within Avid. And then once we do that, we now have full retiming controls and we can tinker with it. And in this instance, if you did have material that was a different frame rate than what you're working in, the main reason to promote it, the main reason to do this would be if you wanted to manipulate the speed of the shot. Say you wanted to retime it to 200%, or if you wanted to do keyframed retimes or something like that, then you would need to promote the temporal adapter that's already there, because you cannot put a speed effect onto a clip that already technically has a speed effect on it. So you wouldn't be able to drop the time warp effect onto it if it already had a temporal adapter laid on within Avid. That's something to note. It is something that came up recently in the forums. It's not necessarily widely known because most people wouldn't work with differing frame rates in the same project, but if you find yourself in that situation, that's something to just be aware of. Also, another thing to be aware of, and this is very important, so I'm going to give this little note its own chapter marker. Within Avid Media Composer, to do any manipulation of a clip, and by manipulation, I mean basic things like resizing, changing the speed of a clip, reframes, anything like that, you must put an effect on the clip. And this differs to other NLEs like Final Cut 10, Premiere, pretty sure Resolve as well, where you can manipulate the properties without putting effects on there. Within Avid Media Composer, you must put an effect on the clip. If you want to change the speed, you'll need Time Warp on there. If you want to zoom in and just change the frame a little bit, you'll need 3D warp or resize on there. It's just something to be aware of. This is probably due to the fact that Avid Media Composer is an NLE that hasn't changed much over the years on purpose in order to maintain backwards compatibility across the years. So you could open up a project made in Avid 10 years ago, and it would open, and you'd be able to play back the timeline if you still had the media, if it was archived and whatnot, without major issues. There are some bugs and stuff going between versions, but you should be able to open up your project and play things down. You could also do this vice versa. You could open a project created today in an Avid version from 10 years ago. You're probably more likely to have some bugs and issues that way, particularly say if you had used new effects and features that had been added in the newer Avid that didn't exist in the older one. Might cause some conflicts. But the point I'm getting at here is that Avid always strives for this backwards compatibility across the decades and across time. And because of that, the Avid basic effects and how it handles media and how you manipulate it hasn't changed over the years. And this has worked to its advantage in terms of turnovers, like in the AAF format, which Avid also created, the AAF. In the sense that all of these effects, all these basic Avid effects are strongly recognized in EDLs and in AAFs. And when you're transferring timelines to other platforms like Resolved, those tweaks and those effects that you've done, the basic ones like reformatting your online work, comes over to online quite well, usually. There's always exceptions to every rule, but I'd say the majority of the time, if things have been done in Avid and you're sending it across in an AF, things come across quite well. So that's the logic there, and that's why they've stuck to this method, and that's why it is the way it is. Right, but that's enough background and theory and introduction to effects. Let's get into the effect palette and start taking a look at some. Right, now, here's the command palette. Just as a reminder, by the way, you can find this under the Tools menu or by hitting Command 8 or Control 8. A quick tour around here. I've shown this in a few videos, but I'll do a quick recap. There are 4 tabs. Filters, this is all your main effects. This is pretty much the only tab I ever use. Then we have transitions, where you can find a bunch of different transitions to use and drag and drop them between 2 clips. Audio track effects that will go track wide. These can be dropped into these 4 little squares here next to the audio track, and will apply track wide to every piece of audio on that track. Or there's audio clip effects, which will be dropped on a clip-by-clip basis. But for this video, we're going to look at filters. And in filters, just like in all the other tabs, we have a whole number of categories. And as we click on each category, we can see the effects contained within on the right. Right now, the best way to show you through the effect palette is to take you through the most commonly used effects. So we're going to look at the effects I use most often, the ones that I go to the effect palette the most often to grab and to put on, and we'll throw them on the timeline. We'll do something with them, have a look around them in the effect editor, and then we'll move on to the next one. Right, so first up, under the blend category, we're going to look at 3D warp. And we're going to look at 3D warp first, because 3D warp is Avid's Swiss Army knife of effects. There are other effects under image, for example, ones like called a resize, where you can zoom in and reframe a shot. There are keying effects like Spectruma and RGB keyer, which we will look at later. There is opacity effects under blend called a superimpose, where we can tinker with the opacity. But if you drop the 3D warp effect onto a clip, you can take care of all of those things under the controls in that one effect, and it's just so much simpler. Then you don't have to nest and stack effects, which again, we'll look at later. Let's take a look at some effects first. So I'm just going to drag and drop 3D warp onto a clip. I've set it to open up my effect editor as soon as I put an effect on, and you don't have to. You can change that in the settings, but it's quite useful for me because if I'm putting an effect on, I want to tinker with it. And here we can see all the controls for 3D warp. Now, let's take a quick look around the effect editor first before we start tinkering around with 3D warp. If you have multiple effects stacked on top of a clip, which you can do by grabbing, further effects and just holding the Option key or Alt key and dragging and dropping these effects on top of a clip that already has an effect on it, and you can stack and stack and stack them, and you can have a bunch of effects on one clip. Though I would recommend, being more efficient where you can, such as using 3D warp instead of all those other effects I mentioned just before, as it will mean less rendering, less thinking for your Avid to do. It doesn't have to think about all these different effects and what they're doing, just this one. But say you did have, 2 or 3 effects on, once you open up the effect editor when you're parked on a clip, you will see all of them here. They will be little, expandable menus that you can tinker with. So here I can see my frame flex. I could make some adjustments to the frame here, and then I could close that and then go into my 3D warp and make some tinkering changes there. Once I open up the effect I actually want to tinker with, then we have a whole bunch of parameters that we can manipulate and alter. So for example, probably one of the most simple is scaling. Let's say we want to zoom in this shot a bit. I can open up the menu for scaling a bit. We have X and Y axis. Now, by default, this is a fixed aspect ratio, meaning if you increase one, it's going to increase the other, and just do a basic zoom. If for whatever reason that's not what you wanted to do, you could untick fixed aspect and just stretch one of these axes. This is not something I have ever done in 10 plus years of being in post, but you have the option to do so. And if you make a whole bunch of changes that you actually decide you don't really want, you can reset a particular parameter by holding Option and clicking on the toggle switch there, and it will reset all that parameter back to defaults, back to 0. This is particularly useful if you're doing something like 3D warp and you have tinkered with scaling, rotation, position, all of these things, but then you've messed up one of them and you want to reset it, but you don't want to, mess with the work you've done on all the others. You can just hold Option and click the toggle switch, and it'll reset that one parameter. And you'll find the controls for all the other parameters in much the same place. So say I want to zoom in like just 20%, I'll resize this to 120. Then say I want to move the position a bit to frame this book a bit more, I can go to position, and I could use these little toggles here, or I could just grab the frame and move it around. There we go, we've framed on the book a bit more. And you can see as I've done this, in this area to the right, which represents the duration of the clip, it's added a keyframe at this point I was parked at. Now, if you were just looking to, zoom in and reframe that clip overall, like you're not looking to do any motion to the clip, then you could delete this keyframe. You don't necessarily need it. If it's a single one keyframe on the shot, it doesn't really matter either way. It's not a big issue. But if you want it to be slightly more clean and tidy, you could delete this keyframe. It will keep all your zoom and reframe that you've done, but there's going to be no movements, for example. Now, if you did want to zoom in across the shot, very easy to do. Keyframing works the same as you would in more or less any graphics or VFX or editing platform. Just add your keyframes. You have the option to do this with a key. This is on the default Avid keyboard, but there's also a clickable button right here to add a keyframe. You add the keyframe, and then you can choose to add it to any groups that are open. The groups meaning the various parameters. So if I select add to open groups, it's going to add it to just position and scaling here. I could choose it to add it to just enabled groups, or by default, if you just hit the keyframe button, it's going to add it to all parameters, which is something you might not necessarily want to do. I kind of wish I could change the default to only ever be open groups. That would suit my workflow the best, because I only ever want a keyframe added to something that I'm changing, because it can mess with some of my keyframing later. But howdy-ho, that's where you can tinker with that. Once you've changed it to open groups, that'll be the default that it'll do when you're tinkering with this clip using your hotkey for add keyframe. So it's not too much more work. Getting back to what we're doing, say I wanted to do a 20% zoom in across this shot. I just jump back to the start, add a keyframe at the start, and then I'll just reset the parameters on that keyframe. And now when we play the shot down, we can see it's going to zoom in and it's going to end on this frame. This shot already does have a little bit of motion on it, so it can be a little bit hard to notice here. Let's find one that's a bit more obvious. Right, change to another shot here. This shot's a bit more static, so zoom in should be a bit more obvious. I've got my monitor here. If I jump to the shot, I'll jump to the front of the shot and play it down. We can see the motion of us zooming in to our lead character there. It's worked, nice. This is also a good time to point out that once you're in the effect editor, your record monitor, which genuinely shows your entire sequence, your entire timeline, will change to play the length of that shot. It just makes it a bit easier to play around with the playhead when you're moving around and adding keyframes and manipulating the shot. You can do that in that one monitor. I also have this workspace set up to show a single monitor. So I'll jump to that when I'm doing effects work. This is much easier because say your normal edit workspace looks something like this, where you might have your source and your record monitors, and you'll have your bins, and that's for editing. But then when you're doing your effects work, it's good to have another workspace specifically for that task, where you can have, your effect palette and your effect editor dots here, a single monitor to give you a bigger view of the clip that you're manipulating, and then you still might want to see your timeline down here as well. And you're most likely still going to want your timeline down there as well if you're doing compositing and there's 2 layers to the effect, stuff like that. But just having separate workspaces for the different purposes, something we spoke about in other videos can be quite useful, and this is what an effects one would look like. Getting back to 3D Warp, however, there are far more parameters for us to manipulate here than just scaling and position, unlike the resize effect. We could change the opacity down here with the foreground effect. We just change the opacity there. You could also change this to a Spectromat key, which would allow you to do full chroma keying, green screen keying, color keying, basically, as well as all your motion tools and whatnot. It's sort of the best go-to effect that is the most versatile and can do the most things. So it does make, for me at least, a lot of the other ones obsolete, but they will still stay in the effect palette for many years to come. for that same backwards compatibility that we talked about earlier. So if you load up a project from years and years ago and they had used the resize effect, Avid will still know how to interpret that and what to do with that, and it can apply the resize effect and play down the timeline. I've got some spill suppression to help with keying, eroding and expanding. We can change the background color. So say I wanted to make this smaller than it is. Now we've got a background here. We can change our background color to something else. And now suddenly we have a bordered shot, you know, in lovely pink. We probably wouldn't do that in this particular instance because it's a, you know, intense short film about the IRA. But, you know, we could. Avid would let us. We have defocusing options where we have various options of defocusing here. And this tool can be useful in a variety of different situations. For example, if you're doing some compositing and you've thrown a 3D warp on your background layer and you're just trying to, you know, soften the focus a little bit to give it some of that depth, you know, or if, particularly, say for example, it's the background that you're keying into a vehicle driving, so your characters are sitting in a vehicle and it's all just blue screen on the windows. You'd want to defocus the background outside a little bit, and that would be a good option to do that there. And we've got other classics like rotation across all three axes, cropping, for example, corner pinning and tracking. A whole bunch more. Now you heard me say tracking there. We do have position tracking, scaling tracking. The tracker within Avid is not bad. It's not the most advanced tracker. It's definitely not the worst tracker I've ever used either, once you know how to use it. But we'll circle back to tracking in a bit. For now, this is a general overview of 3D Warp with your tools and some of its uses. With all the tools that you will find for it, in the effect editor, and some of its uses. It is a very versatile effect that you'll find in a lot of situations. Now, before we jump to the next effect as well, I just want to point out, I'm not going to go through them all because this is a bit more advanced. I've shown it in a couple of other videos, but I just want to make you aware of these buttons that are along the right, because I was using Avid for years before I actually knew about these. And these buttons just are expanding your effects toolkit beyond these toggle switches and controls over on the left. So for example, if I, instead of typing values and using the sliders for scaling and position, I could enable scale here, which I think is actually on by default. And then I can zoom out. Here, Avid calls it reduce and enlarge, but it's basically zoom in and out. That's because Avid refers to zoom in and out as actually zooming in and out of the timeline, whereas reduce and enlarge is just making your viewer bigger or smaller for your own viewing. I always zoom out a little bit, or reduce a little bit before I start doing effects work so I can see the whole picture. If I have this scale button enabled here, then I could just grab the corner and scale it down. I can also move it around and just do exact placements there. I can use the top and bottom to manipulate that way. And of course, we've got our undo command to save our butts there as well. Now we can do the same thing with crop, which we'll find up here, which will allow us to, you know, very precisely crop in, top, bottom, left, right, which is just a lot easier than using the cropping sliders that you'll find on the left. Since we can zoom in precisely and crop to just the exact amount that we want. And there is also toggle buttons here for doing rotations, like say on the y-axis, this would look like this. And we get a nice wireframe view of the whole plane that we're rotating here as we do this. And then once we let go, we can see it rotated. So I've found myself using this method much more in recent years as opposed to the toggles on the left. I'll still definitely use these and the sliders, but if I'm doing a screen insert or something like that, I find this is a much faster and just more tactile way of going about it. Even though I'm not actually touching anything, it's more visual and allows you to put it in a lot quicker. You know, we can bring up grids, we can play the shot.
You're lying to me.
if we just want to quickly watch down the shot that we're manipulating. We can also play the shot on a loop if we just want to watch it down and see your effect and make some judgments. Sometimes you need to watch it down a few times. So having it on a loop will help you, see if your effect's working. Yeah, we've got a number of buttons there on the right that are quite useful as well. And know that all of those buttons can be mapped to your keyboard from the command palette by going to the Effects tab. You'll find them all there. It's your poly tool, brush tools, reduce and enlarge, all that good stuff. Now, rounding out our tour of the effect editor before we move on to the next effect, down here, coming down from our buttons, we have this little slider which allows us to move forward and backward on our timeline. All of these different rows here are for each parameter. The top one is global, and this bright area here in the middle is our shot. So before and after that is the same shot, but what's not represented in the timeline. Moving left from that, we have a little zoom in button that we can slide up and down. So if we want to be more finicky and we're doing keyframing, every 2 or 3 frames, say, and it's a long shot, like there's 16 frames between these 2 keyframes, and we want to be a bit more fiddly, we can zoom right in by sliding that on, and then we can make our adjustments. To the left of that, we've got our keyframe button, which we'd already talked about. To the left of that is our go to next event, go to previous event. Which on terms of the effect editor is going to mostly just jump between the keyframes that you have up on here. To the left of there is a timer. Now this will only really apply if the effect you're editing is a transition. You'll be able to type in here the exact number of seconds and frames that you want the duration of your transition to be, and it will contract and expand accordingly to what you've set. Similarly, the button on the left is for aligning a transition, so aligning it to the head of a cut, centering it around the cut, or after the cut, or you can customize it to be an exact, or you can hit custom at the bottom of the menu to center it on a particular point. Similarly, this next little button over here, outline path, this is going to show a little line showing the direction that any motion that you've added to the effect is going to follow. So you can see this line here, you can see where it starts and ends. It's going to zoom in that direction, on that plane. If I was to add more keyframes, like say I'll add, get real complex here, and I'll add one here, and then I'll move the shot over there, and then I'll add another keyframe here, and I'll move the shot down here. We can see the movement directions that the shot's going to follow across its life with this little outline path here. Now we can turn this off, and now, you can move this shot around, and then you just won't see that. You'll just visually see the whole wireframe of the shot move around. But it is on by default, and I've never really felt the need to turn it off. It's quite a useful little indicator. If you were doing one that had a lot of movement, then maybe a very extravagant squiggly line might get a little bit annoying to have on screen. But 9 times out of 10, I'd say it's quite useful to have. And your last little button here down on the left is to render the effect. So if you've done everything you want to do, everything's working, it's nice and pretty, you can render the effect there. And your options to do this, application is going to just render it right there in front of you. It'll freeze up the application while it renders it. It should be fairly quick if it's one effect. Background process, it'll do it in the background. Again, if it's one effect, it's not going to take long probably. Distributed processing is great out here. That's only if you have a few computers all networked together and you're treating them basically as a little server farm. So it's going to spread the workload across them. But that's something else to deal with another day. Now, generally, I will play my effects live without rendering, probably about 6 or 7 times out of 10. When I go to lunch or something, if I'm in a facility, like whenever I'm leaving my Avid for a while, I might set it off to render the whole timeline. I'll definitely do this before a viewing. In fact, before an important viewing, if we're getting execs in or something like that, there's a good chance that I might actually just do a mix down where it'll make baked media of your entire timeline, which will guarantee a much smoother, playback performance. And you can find your mix downs by just selecting your whole timeline or the whole area that you want to include in the mix down, and then go timeline, mix down. And you can do these for audio and video. And creating a video mixdown, it's not the same as rendering effects. You'll still have unrendered effects on there. But if you were to have a mixdown of the whole timeline, you'll get baked media that you can slap on the top layer above, and then it's just going to read that and play it down. And now, even if you had, you know, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 effects all stacked together, Avid's not going to struggle because it's rendered. It's just playing one straight bit of media. There's nothing complicated about it. And so if you're showing it to execs, if you get a big important viewing, it can be a good idea. But if it's my director that I'm working with, I'll probably just render the timeline before the viewing, because we'll do lots of manipulations and tweaks, and you generally get a much more sort of closer working relationship with the director anyway. So, you know, they could probably be a bit more forgiving of, you know, any slight Avid hiccups, which may or may not occur. I must admit, I don't actually get that many. I find Avid to be very stable. Right, that's enough of me going off on a tangent. Let's take a look at another effect. And give me a random effect, totally random effect, not pre-planned or scripted in any way, please. Animatte. Okie dokie. So Animatte, you'll find under key, Animatte. Now, Animatte is basically your masking tool. Here you can build masks to do basic compositing. When you don't have green screen layers, you can draw masks or use masks of any basic shape and do compositing onto different layers. Right, so for my example here for Animatte, we're going to use both the Animatte and 3D Warp tool. So here we can see in this shot we have a computer monitor here, and we're going to insert some security camera footage into the monitor. So I'm going to grab my CCTV, put it on top, and now opening that in Effect Editor, we've got 3D Warp on here, and I'm just going to size this down to fit in that computer monitor. So I'm just going to do it on top so that I can see it behind. Sizing this down. Then I'll zoom in a bit. This is my reduce and enlarge keys. And then once you've zoomed in beyond, so you can't see the edges, if you hold Command and Option, then you'll get the cursor will change to a little hand, and you can move the monitor about. I only really need this section here because there's my computer monitor. And I'll keep my scaling on, make that a bit smaller. Then I need to rotate it a little bit, align that with the top of the monitor there. And then I'm just going to sit this kind of in the middle here and make it slightly bigger than the borders of the monitor. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to drag this and put it underneath this image. Right, so it's underneath, so we can't see because Avid's effects and its picture follows a hierarchy. So this clip is sitting above, so we can't see anything below it just now. But we're going to change that by drawing a mask over the computer monitor inside the bezels there, so we can see through into our CCTV footage. So I've dropped Animatte on, not done anything to it yet. All blank in here. This is what the effect editor looks like with Animatte. It does look a bit different. And now we need to draw a shape first. We need a mask before we can start tinkering with any parameters. We have various options here. So we can draw like a rectangular mask. We draw an oval one. I will say 9 times out of 10, I will always use this one here. It's called the Poly tool, which will just allow you to draw any shape based on a set of points. So I'll click on that to enable. And then I'll just click on my 4 points here to draw my shape. And now I have a mask. But by default, it's keeping what is inside the shape and seeing through everything else, which is not what we want. We want to swap that screen by clicking this button up here under foreground, swap screen. So swap that mask around. Right, so now we're looking through and we just need to finesse this a little bit. So I will come to my 4 corners. I'm just going to make sure that they're roughly in the right place. It's probably more the 3D warp in the image that needs refining, to be honest with you. But we'll do it here anyway. This one's been done quite quick and dirty, so it's not perfectly aligned, but that's okay. You'll get the idea. And then with my shape selected, I'll add a little bit of feathering. So down here, there's our feathering. We've got horizontal and vertical sliders, and then the bias. So if we enable the horizontal and vertical sliders a bit, we'll get some feathering. You can see it taking effect there if I drag it way to the right. But we only want a tiny bit, really. just so that we don't have super hard edges. I'd normally just go to 2 or 3 points. And then our bias is whether we're feathering to the inside or the outside of the shot. So I'll go slightly to the left. Really, without that selected, I just don't want such a hard edge. And then if you wanted to refine this further, you just select the shot below where you had your 3D warp on, your fill, what's going inside the monitor, and just move that around a bit to make sure it looks right. Even that's starting to look a bit better. But we'll rotate that back a little bit. Center this. That's already looking better. Not perfect, but it'll do for the purposes of showing it. So that is Animatte. We have a mask. There are some more controls in there. If your mask was moving, we can track it. You know, we can add some coloring and shapes and things. But that is your basic principles of adding a mask. If you had to keyframe your mask, you can go about in here and add keyframes across the duration of the shot and change the size of it, what it's tracking. And if you select the reshape tool button, then you will be able to manipulate your shape once again and reconfigure it without rebuilding the whole shape again. You can also do this on a keyframe by keyframe basis, so your shape expands and contracts and it gets more complex and more simple as the shot goes on. But this is only something you'd be doing if you were doing some more complex compositing a bit later on. Say you had to mask a person, you might do something a bit more like that with a lot more control points. But that gives you the overview of Animatte. It is your masking tool. It is the go-to masking tool for all Avid editors. It is very, very useful, and I've used it countless times. Moving on from that one, give me another effect, please. Timecode generator. Right, so under the generator category, we have two. We have Subcap, which is Avid's captioning tool, but we won't look at Subcap just now in this video. I could do a different one just talking about Subcap. I could do a full 15-20 minutes on that and using it. So if that's something that you're interested in, you know, we can do that again another time. But the one whose lucky number was drawn up was Timecode generator. So let's take a look at you. And this is our generator for, you know, well, showing timecode, but not just timecode. We can show lots of stuff with the timecode generator. So by default, we get 4 displays, 4 generators that we can show. By default, it's going to add sequence timecode as your first one, but you can change this to show just about any pertinent information or metadata that is associated with the clip. So straight off the bat, I could change this to the source timecode. You'll see it change here. I'll make this a good bit bigger so it's easier to see. There we go. So we could change that to source timecode. We could change it to frames, frame count. We could change it to the sequence name of our sequence. We could change it to the clip name. So there we go, 2L take 2. And this is reading whatever clip it's currently on. It's currently set to by default current track. So if you've put your timecode generator on the top track, which I have done here, then it's just going to look downward on the first piece of media that it hits. It's going to read from that clip. But you can set it to read a specific track. So say you have a track for your visual effects, you have a track for your color effects, you have a track for graded clips and stuff, but all of your original media is just on V1, something that might happen towards the end and onlining and tidying your timeline and stuff. You could just set it to specifically look at V1 and ignore everything else. And then if there's no media on V1 at that particular point, it will just show something like filler. Or if it doesn't show filler, it'll show something called no column data. So basically no data available. We can also configure this to show any metadata that's in the bin. So if I set this to source bin column, all of these metadata columns from the bin, so I could show, for example, the drive that it's on. This is on my RAID, it's called Falcon Bay. I could show the raster dimensions, if I wanted, 1440 by 1080. I could show the frame count start, which by default is set to 0, and I haven't set a specific one for this. I could set it to read video, so DNX HD 1080. I can set it to read any metadata at all from the bin, including any custom columns that I've added. For example, I have a custom column here called AE notes. And so say if I was to add a little note saying, you know, preferred take. It's just the first thing that came to mind. And then I jump back to my reader here. Then instead of video, I would choose an option called custom property, which I find down here. And then you just type the name of whatever your custom bin column is. So mine was AE notes. And then you can see the data shows up right there, preferred take. This is a really great way for showing burn-ins of stuff like source clip name, tape name, for doing your online turnovers and things like that, as well as any particular info that you might want in there. So for example, when I was working in animation, we'd be sending exports of sequences of the film to the various departments, and these would be for, like, say, weekly reviews. And in these exports, some shots would be ready for review, some would not be. So we'd have a custom column called review status, and we would either type review or not for review, and we'd just copy and paste it into the different shots, metadata columns, whether they were for review or not, and that would show up here as a burn-in dynamically, without us having to tinker with any slugs or tinker with it on a shot-by-shot basis on the timeline. The timecode generator would just read it from the bin metadata. It's awesome. There is more that you can do here. For example, you can do the same metadata thing with the sequence and read any value from the sequence and have that in there as a burn-in. But I'll leave that to you to explore and tinker with. It will always show up like this with a black background with white text, but you can tinker with that. I generally put the opacity down to about 0.1, 0.2. And then we'll change the text and make the text a bit bigger. And you can change the opacity of the text as well, and the color of the text and whatnot. So you can tinker with the way that it looks and just grab any of these anchor points to move the positioning. Unfortunately, we'll always anchor to the top left, and you can't change that. For some reason, you can change it in subcap, and you can change it in other Avid effects. But for the timecode generator, you are stuck with the top left as the anchor point for the text, for some reason. Should note as well that while you do get 4 of these displays, 4 of these generators within the one effect, you also do get a text generator. So we would usually use this as our watermark. That way we could drag a single effect on there, and we would have our watermark, say property of X Productions, as well as burn-ins holding our timecode and all the other generators. And it just meant we had to drag and drop one preset effect on there, on the top of our timeline, and everything was ready to go, and then we could export. So this is footage from edit stock. So I could put edit stock on there, make it really big, throw the opacity down in the background, and maybe have the text a bit. And since edit stock is a small word, I'll say property of. And then I would put that about there, and I would export that with this one being timecode. And that would be a rough example of what a burn-in might look like for a viewing export. You know, we may need more or less, depends on your situation and exactly what you need. Now, something that I should have showed earlier, but I'll show it here since we've configured this one to a very specific configuration. The way to save an effect, and this is all effects, anything that can be opened in the effect editor, with the exception of stuff like frame flex and temporal adapters, stuff that's pre-applied. But any other effects, once you have configured it, and if you want to save it as a preset, simply grab the icon up here next to the name of the effect and just drag and drop it into a bin. By default, it'll just be named the name of the effect, but you can rename it whatever you like. So I'll say export burn-ins. And now I can drag that onto any sequence I like to quickly apply my burn-ins. So I'll get rid of it from this timeline here and just drag this preset on. And you can see that that's been applied onto my timeline there, ready for export. Nice. Right, now next effect. Give me another effect. It's definitely totally random and not pre-planned in advance. Avid Pan and Zoom. So the Pan and Zoom effect is Avid's way of bringing in stills. It is the best way to bring in stills into your project by a country mile. There is issues just importing or even linking to them and bringing them in, it's not ideal. It will create media and it'll limit it to a specific set duration, making it, you know, harder to stretch and move around. Also, with the sizing of the image, because they tend to have much larger pixel density, you know, than a movie, which will tend to be, say, 1080p most of the time, or, you know, if they're shot for filming, you know, say 4 or 8K, but a still could be, you know, ridiculously high pixel density, and Avid's still not great at dealing with that. And so the best way to deal with it is the Avid Pan and Zoom effect. So say you wanted to bring in a logo and have it as a little burn-in on the lower left here of your image, right? So you'll drop in the Avid Pan and Zoom effect. This is a good way to show as well that any effect in Avid can be placed on an empty filler track. If you do so, then it will apply to everything below it, or you can apply an effect directly onto a clip. You can make your choice and do either or. The effects definitely work in a hierarchy in Avid, so just another thing to note. But I'm going to open up the Avid Pan and Zoom effect here, and you can see we've got a whole bunch of different options and controls here, but I want you to ignore those for now. Right up the top, it says Import Image. So I'm going to click on Import Image, and I'm going to grab my Avid Assistant logo just here, which I've got on this lovely t-shirt that I like, and I'll import that. So I hit open, and now I've got my image here in my Avid Pan and Zoom effect. Right now, by default, the Avid Pan and Zoom effect is set to display source, meaning that it's just going to show the image. Even if your image is a PNG or it's relatively small, it'll add a black background around, and you know, that's all you'll be able to see once, you know, you're viewing that track that your Avid Pan and Zoom effect's on as your image. Now this may be great, this may be exactly what you're looking for. If you're looking for a placeholder, if you want a title card up there and you've made it in an image outside of Avid. But if, like we were talking about before, if we're just looking to use this as a logo, we're just putting it on top of our existing video, then I would change our display to target. So this means in the effect editor, it's going to show us the changes that we're making. It's not just going to show us our source picture. And then down here where it says background is color, I've changed this to background video. So now it's changed it to just show what's behind. And then we can just use our zoom factor here under the size to make it a bit smaller. And I'll use my position controls here to place it in the lower corner here. As opposed to maybe just linking in or importing the clip, is duration, meaning that there's no specific duration applied. You can drag and drop and expand this as long or short as you like. There isn't a heck of a lot of controls within the Avid Pan and Zoom effect. If you're wanting to tinker with opacity, or if you're wanting to use this image as part of a composite, then I would advise linking in the image instead, using the link function in the source browser. But if you're just wanting to slap in a logo there to go across the entire thing, that would be how you go about it. Right, now time for the next effect. What are we going to have now? Spectromat. Right, so this one should be really quick. You can find it under keying at the bottom, Spectromat. And this is what I'd use as my go-to keyer for any kind of green screen stuff or something like that, where I'll drag and drop it onto my clip. I've got everybody's favorite John Travolta confused green screen here that we've all seen a million times. And I'm just going to key out the green and just slap over a wide shot in the middle of this short film. Opening this up in the effect editor, the first thing you're always going to want to do is click this bypass control that's up the top, because for some reason there's a default keying color set, which is a shade of blue, and unless you have a perfectly clean shot, this is going to change how the shot looks, and it's going to mess with your key a little bit. So before you choose the color that you want as your key, you're going to want to disable that, so that then you're getting an accurate representation of your shot. Then click on your key color, and you'll get a little, color picker. And then just come over to where all your green is, or your blue, or whatever it is the color that you want to key out. Pick a pixel that has it, and click on that. Now we can see that's been chosen, because in our key color, it's changed that color. Now if I undo the bypass, we have our key. Now, if you're not entirely happy with the edges, I mean, you can, you know, tinker with the tolerance. There's a lot of chroma controls here. You know, I find the inner and outer softness and the tolerance to be the ones that really help, as well as, you know, maybe the spill controls down here with light spill of your key color. Meddle a bit with those. I advise you to experiment. That was how I was taught, is basically how Spectrum, you know, the basic principles, and then just, you know, fiddle with the controls till you get it right. And it's mostly worked out well for me. Now, in this situation, we have him looking a little bit too big. You know, he looks a bit out of size, out of context for the shot. So we could reframe him a little bit. Now, one way to do this would have been to put a 3D warp effect on first and then stack it by alt-dragging a spectrum matte effect on there. But another way you can do this is a number of effects. You have this little option down here. It says promote. Now, if you click on that, it's going to basically keep all the effects work you've done, but it's also going to change all the controls to give you all the controls of 3D warp within the same effect. And it'll allow you to do this as long as your effect that you're tinkering with is in some way related to 3D warp. So if it's resize, picture-in-picture, spectrum matte, stuff like that, then you'll have this option. It also works great for matte keys. So if you bring in a matte key, you already get a number of controls like this, but you can promote those to a 3D matte key, and then you've got a lot more motion and moving around effects. So I'm going to promote this, and then I'll say scale him up just a little bit, and then I can move him down, you know, something like that. Just say that he's like just entered in, you know, say he's like walking across, you know. I mean, we could go the other way as well. We could scale him right down, which probably makes more sense, to be honest. Say we'll put him down a bit further, say 60%. You know, and we'll put him in the scene just here. So now if we watch this down, well, Johnny's all confused, doesn't know why he's here. And there's your spectrum matte and a very basic key. On you go, have a crack at it in your own Avid, and let me know how you get on. Next up, Timewarp. Righty-ho. Right, so Timewarp and time effects, I'm not going to talk about too deeply, but I'll give you an overview and show you how to, you know, make quick time adjustments and keyframing that will cover most use cases probably. So first off, within the effect palette, in the Timewarp category, we have a number of options here. You know, speed boost, reverse motion, freeze frame, but essentially all of these are just presets of the Timewarp effect. Really, that's all they really are. 9 times out of 10, I'll only ever just grab the Timewarp from here, with the one exception being trim to fill. Trim to fill can be quite useful, because what that'll do when you drag on is, you know, as you move a clip and trim it and extend it, it's going to retime the existing media that was there and stretch it to fit that new duration. So that can be useful in plenty of use cases. But for the most part, whenever I'm wanting to make any kind of time adjustments, I'm going to grab Timewarp, which is going to do absolutely nothing until you configure it. That is just enabling speed controls, timing controls, essentially. So with that dropped on, we don't see it in the effect editor because it gets its own very own effect editor called the motion effect editor, which again, you'll find under tools, motion effect editor. Now, when we first bring this up, we can see Timewarp up here. We've got our icon that we can drag out once we've configured. And we've got these two icons here, position graph and speed graph. For now, let's look at speed graph, since this will be the most commonly used one. And here we have a graph showing position across here is the position of the shot, at what point in the shot. And the y-axis of the graph is showing the speed the shot is at. And we have this slider here, so we can condense this so that we can still see really high speeds or really low speeds. You know, we're getting more of a range of the graph, basically. But your standard view will be useful for most people. But pressing on, down here, where it says 100, that is the current speed is 100%, so normal speed. If we want this to go faster, then we just increase that number. So say we want to go double speed, we just type 200%. Now if I play that down, this is a man getting searched after he's been passed out. So he's going through his pockets very, very quickly. This is from a short film called The Treasure that I've worked on. Used it in a lot of the videos, but just FYI, I'll say it there again. The link to the short will be down below. Now, say we wanted the shot to speed ramp in speed as it went across. Then we can just apply keyframes. So I'll reset this to 100. There's always a keyframe on your first frame anyway. And then I'll go along a little bit, add another keyframe. There's a button for it here. And then if I part on that keyframe and it's selected, you can manipulate the speed there. So say I'll say 300%. Probably a better example of this speed ramp actually will be to do the reverse. So we will actually start it at 300. And we'll let it stay at 300 for a bit actually. And then you'll see it change. So it's going to be at 300% for here, and then ramp down back to normal speed, and then play at normal speed. So let's play that and see. Very, very fast, very, very fast. And now normal. Nice and easy. And that more or less covers the basics. You can do some pretty advanced speed retiming and keyframing here just by adding in keyframes, nudging them up or down. You can just click and drag if you want, but I'll always prefer to type values. So you just go below 100 to slow down and above 100 to speed up, with 100 being your baseline. There are a number of buttons along here as well. So we have our go to next and previous event. That's going to skip along our keyframes again. We can enable trim mode and play from here and play our loops from here, just like in our effect editor. We can remove effects and render effects, and we've got our match frame button there as well. Now we've got this drop down menu up here that we had in our temporal adapters that we talked about at the start as well. And well, I'm still not going to go through them all in detail. I'll just talk a little bit more about them. So these are essentially different ways of Avid implementing the speed effect that you're doing. Whether that be blending frames together, like down here, blended interpolated, for example, or fluid motion, which takes a little while longer to render, but usually looks better in the end. It's a bit smoother. These are just different methods of applying that speed effect to video, and different ways of recalculating the frames to get that speed effect. So I would recommend, if you're going to be doing this a lot, to read into these, and depending on your use case, depending on the shot, the effect, what you're doing, select the right one that's best for you. Right, now I think that's enough about specific effects. You've had a fairly good introduction to a lot of the most common ones and, their uses and, shown examples. But before we round out the video, there's a couple of things to do with effects that I want to, go back and touch on more. We're going to take a look at tracking and we're going to take a look at nesting. And as we do this, we're going to recap a lot of the stuff that we've done before. So it'll be a good sort of way to round out the video. So let's get started. So here's the scene we looked at earlier where we had our fun little confused John Travolta in the middle of our short film. Now we're going to track Johnny Boy here with the movement of a shot. Now this shot does have a little bit of movement in it, but not a whole lot that is going to be noticeable. So I picked a bit of a more fun one, and I've already done it, so I'll show you how it looks here. So we've got John behind the car here in the middle of this scene, and the camera's going to pan all the way to the left, and he's going to go out of frame. And there we go. A very simple track, but it looks great. He's followed the camera movement, he's went out of frame, and we could believe that he was in that scene, or at least it would pass for an offline visual effect comp anyway. So how do we go about doing that? Let me show you. Right, so all I've done so far is I've keyed out the green and then promoted the spectrum art to 3D warp. So from here, I'll just bring down the scaling a little bit, say 70%, maybe a little higher, 85, yeah, that works. And then I'll throw John over here. So there's roughly in scale between our two characters. We want him to be on the far side of this car. And something to note when you're placing your character or your shot in their position before you enable your track, you're going to want to do this with the playhead parked on the first frame of the shot. It just makes it a bit cleaner, especially when there's going to be motion and tracking, because if you do it in the middle, especially if you're jumping back and the playhead's moving and then you recenter them again, it could create a keyframe each time, which can then lead to messed up tracking because it tries to respect the position it was at those particular keyframes. So we want the tracker to be deciding where the shot is, as opposed to our keyframes, with the exception of the very start. So we have Johnny placed, he's in the right position. Now we're going to track him. Since we can see at the end of the shot, the camera pans, but he stays exactly where he is. So we want him to be at that fixed position in the room. So I'm going to come to the position parameter here. And I'm going to enable position tracking. As soon as you do, the tracking window will come up. It looks like this, and you'll get this little tracking point. Now you're going to want to pick a fairly good contrast, a fixed point in the room somewhere. Ideally, something that stays present throughout the entire shot, something that's not covered at any point during the shot. Now we know that our character Martha over here is going to walk camera right to camera left as the camera pans. So it's going to be covered from about her head height across this way. So anything above her should be fine, and we can skim along the shot to see what we can see. And I like where these shells meet over here, this little crossbeam. It's a nice fixed point that's clear, it's in focus, it doesn't go out of frame. That will make a good tracking point. So I'm going to leave my tracking point on there, and then come over here to my tracking window and click this button to start tracking. And then let Avid track that shot and the movement that it has throughout the shot. That's that done. It's quite a small shot. So I'll come out of there and then watch down my shot, and we can see that Johnny is tracked and fixed at his location that we've set. Nice. Now, one thing to mention here in the tracking before I move on and we mask him around the car and just put him more cleanly in the shot, is that if you couldn't find a fixed point that is, not covered at any point during the shot, like say you had a great tracking point, but somebody walks past it. For example, if we made this our tracking point, it would work great, except for the fact that Martha's going to walk past it, and then this is going to ruin our track. Well, what you could do is run your track like that, and then you'll see it get messed up when Martha walks past it. And then come back to your tracker, and then go to the point where just before your track's about to get messed up. All right? Now, over here in the tracking window, just right-click along here. This is denoting the length of the shot, and this is a little playhead here, and this is your tracking point. You can have multiple tracking points, by the way, to track depth, and for better accuracy you can create them here, but we only really need one for this. So we're going to go to that point, and then you're going to right click in this timeline here, and you're going to go add new tracker region. And this will allow you to set a different tracking point from this point onward in the shot. So you can have your tracking point, this is tracking point A, is tracking here, this lower corner here, up until this point in the shot. And then from then onward, I want you to track this point of the shot. And then hit start tracking, it's going to do that. So if I'll come out of that, you see that should have worked pretty much just as well, and it has. So that's how you'd solve a tracking issue if you had no clean tracking points that are visible and in focus and not covered throughout the duration of your shot. You can pick one that is visible at the start and track it up to the point where it becomes messed up, and then add a new tracker region and track somewhere else for the remainder of the shot. You can do this as many times as you need to, and it saved my bacon a few times. It's a great little feature. As I've said before, Avid's tracker is not the best in the world by any stretch, but it's definitely not the worst that I've used. It's not half bad. And should you need to make any adjustments to your tracking on any effect, you can bring up the tracking window with this little icon here in the effect editor at any time. Right, moving on from tracking, we can see that we've got a bit of an issue where Johnny is in front of the car here, and we want him to be placed behind. It looks like he's just kind of floating here. So we're going to create an Animatte mask around the edge of the car and around Johnny so that he looks like he's behind. So to do that, we're going to go to our Effect Palette, key, Animatte, like we did before, and I'm going to hold the Option key and click and drag my Animatte on top of the 3D warp. And now if I double click on that, which opens up the nest, Avid calls it stepping in, we can see the effects that are stacked on top of this shot. So we have a base layer with nothing where we could drag another effect on if we wanted to put it at the base layer. Then we have our 3D warp, and then we have our Animatte. With me so far? Good. So I'll jump into my Animatte, go to my effect editor. You'll see where I need to draw my mask, where I need to draw my edge, is actually covered by my character right now, and that's going to be a problem. So before I draw my mask, I'm going to jump back to my 3D warp in the effect editor, go to the foreground parameter and just turn the opacity to 0, just to hide Johnny for a moment while I draw my mask. Now if I jump back to Animatte, I can open my poly tool and draw my mask. I like to go around the outside of the frame. That's why I've zoomed out or reduced a little bit just to make this easier. And I'll connect that up there. Right. Now if I hop back to my 3D warp and throw my foreground back up, you can see he now looks nice and nestled behind the car. Good so far. I'll come back to my Animatte. I'll just fix up this edge a little bit. I'll zoom in over here. This is because I was doing this zoomed out a little bit that I've missed the edges here, where I can select a shape and I'll go reshape tool like we talked about before, and I'll just fix these up. There we go, that's a bit better. Just move this one away from Martha, our character there. Sweet, that'll do it. And then I'll just feather this a little bit, probably about 3, and then bias it that way. Now if I zoom out, now that's looking a lot better. He's nice and nestled behind the car. Not perfect again, but it's a lot better. So to recap where we are so far, we have Johnny sized and placed behind the car. We've keyed out his green screen. We've tracked Johnny through the shot and through the pan, and we've masked him out. But there's one more thing left to do. We have to track the mask, because otherwise you can see here, Johnny moves but the mask stays and it looks really weird and it's kind of messing him up. Now we could go back to Animatte, click our shape, enable tracking up here, and then do the track again. Or a cleaner way to go about this is to first come to our 3D warp where we've tracked Johnny, open up our tracking window, right click here where it says point A and go copy enabled tracks. So we've copied. And then come back to our Animatte, select our shape, enable tracking. And now we're going to delete this tracking point that we have here. There's a little cross right up here. We can just click that to delete. And then we're going to right click and paste tracks. And it's going to paste the tracking data from the 3D warp, which is ideal because then you're using the exact same tracking information that you used to track Johnny to track the mask. And we want them to move in unison as if they're one thing. So using the exact same tracking information is ideal. You can see now if I cross out of this, just come up here under tracking and make sure that it's actually selected that tracking point. Sometimes it doesn't. Now if I slide along, both the mask and Johnny are tracked in place. That would be me more or less done with this comp. I'd be happy with that, and I would pass that on for editorial viewings. Again, it isn't perfect, but it would more than pass offline viewings by execs or directors. Would work perfectly well up until you pass it over to VFX for them to do, their own version. So that gives you a good introduction to tracking and how that works. But I want to jump back a bit before and touch on what we were looking at when we did what Avid refers to as stepping in. So when we stepped in like this. Now, if I was to stack more and more effects on here, we would be able to just keep, stepping in more and more layers. And this is called nesting effects. So here we're nesting effects within one shot, but we can also throw multiple shots and effects all together into a nest of itself. So it only takes up one video track. So for example, if I wanted to nest both parts of this comp, so the background and the foreground, I could select them both and then I just click this option here. I've mapped it here from the command palette. It's not natively there, but you can map it to here or you can map it to your keyboard. It's called collapse. And that is going to collapse these into a nest. Like so. And there we go. Now that's much tidier on our timeline. This is especially true if you are doing a comp that requires, you know, 3, 4, 5 video tracks to do. It doesn't often happen, but I have done this on multiple occasions where, say, I'm adding in multiple muzzle flashes, you know, bullet hits or blood spurts, as well as comping in a background all on one shot, and then they can kind of stack up. And when that happens, it does really help to collapse them into a nest like this, and then you can throw them onto one layer specifically reserved for effects work. So for here, I've got V5 for that. I could throw it on V5. And I can double click again to step in at any point and take a look at the effects and configure anything in here and tweak the comp, or even swap out the shots that are being used here. You know, I can load up another shot and I can patch it inside the nest and I can cut into that. In fact, this is actually a really good way of tweaking the portion of a shot you're using for a comp. So say, for example, you wanted to keep all the effects work that you've done, but you wanted to swap it out for a different take. Well, for example, here I'm on 1 Charlie take 2. I could grab 1 Charlie take 3, like I have here, and I could patch this directly into my nest, like so, and cut that in. And now that's part of the comp. Now this wouldn't be ideal for this particular comp, since we've tracked to the specific movement and masked to the specific shape of 1 Charlie take 2. So I'll just undo that. But maybe a better example actually would be if I wanted a different portion of our John Travolta shot. So if I match framed on that, then I could go to a bit later in the shot, and then I could cut that directly into our nest. So just step it in and go back to the very base layer without a shot on it. Here it is here. Then I can just patch that in, hit T to mark, and overwrite. And now it's going to begin with that section a bit later in the shot. But I didn't have to redo any of my effects work. I've still got it all right there. Now, nesting your effects within Avid Media Composer is a really, really useful method. It can save you a lot of time. There are just a couple of things to be aware of, however. Firstly is it can be a bit of a pain to unnest something once you've nested it. Now, there are ways you can expand out, click and select all the tracks and click and drag them out. This particular version of Avid seems to have a bug where that causes a problem when you do that. You can throw them into a sequence, load them in the source monitor, and cut them out onto tracks. But again, it can just be a little bit of a pain to extract the shots out of the nest, which can cause issues with, say, you wanted to show source timecode from these tracks. You know, you're sending to online, particularly your hero plate, your main plate of your actual footage. You want to show the timecode from that. You want to show source file name. If they're baked inside of a nest, then you can't select the exact track for your timecode generator to read, so you can be missing information there. So what I would normally do is my main hero plate I'll always keep on V1, and when I go to do any actual effects work, I'll make a copy of it, drag it up, do all my effects, and then nest it and put that on my effects layer. So I'll always keep a copy of the source plate on V1 untouched without any effects work on it. And that way that's sort of preserved for doing turnovers and things like that. And you can just tweak this one here when you need to change the effect in any way. And if I do slide it, add handles using a different portion of the shot, I'll also modify, my hero play on V1 as well, just so that that's represented for reference purposes. But there we go. I think that comp there sort of covers tracking and nesting. If you have any questions, you can leave a comment below. This video ended up being one of the longest records I think I've done. I had a lot of cutting down to do. This has taken quite a bit of time. So I think I'm going to have to plan these out a bit better. Just need to find the time to do that as well. Just so you're aware, guys, there's a whole lot that goes into making these videos. It takes a good long amount of time, and I don't really have a whole lot of it in general. I have a family and I work full-time in post. So, if you are asking for videos and further tutorials and questions and emailing me and other things, just please be aware if I'm taking a little bit of time to get back to you, that is why. This is a hobby that I do on the side. This isn't something that I profit from in any way. It is just something that I do because I enjoy helping and I enjoy making the videos. So if I'm taking a little while to get back to you, just bear in mind, I will get there, I promise. It just might take a little bit of time. Speaking of time, thank you very much for watching through the video, especially if you've made it to the end and you're still listening. Thank you very much. I do really appreciate it, especially to the Patreon subscribers. It really does mean a lot that anyone would be willing to, give any amount of money to see any of this kind of content. So, thank you very much. Do appreciate it. Now, I suppose I better go start making a good formalized plan for the next video so I don't waffle for 3 hours and then have to spend days and days cutting it down. So yeah, I'm going to go spend a little bit of time with my family before the kids go to sleep, and then I start writing and planning out the next video. And somehow find time to sleep among all the rest of the stuff. Kind of forgotten what sleep's like at this point. But thanks again for watching, guys. See you next time.